All right, so are you ready to dive into the world of Iron Man?
Yeah, let's do it. It's always fascinating to go back and look at the origins of these iconic characters.
Absolutely. And this one is particularly interesting because we're not just talking about the comic book history. We're really focusing on that game-changing 2008 film that kind of blew the doors open for the entire MCU.
Right. It's easy to forget now with how massive the MCU has become. But back then, Iron Man was a bit of a gamble. He wasn't exactly a household name like Spider-Man or Batman.
Totally. So to really dig into this, we've got a great stack of source material. We've got that behind-the-scenes look from Time magazine, which is always a fun read, the nitty-gritty details from Wikipedia, of course, and then this really thought-provoking film analysis that I'm excited to get into.
Yeah, the analysis really digs deep into the themes and the cultural context of the film, which is something I always find fascinating. So are we ready to kind of take this apart and see what made Iron Man tick?
Let's do it. Let's start by rewinding the clock. Iron Man's journey to the big screen, it wasn't exactly a straight shot to success, was it?
Oh, not at all. It's actually a pretty wild ride. I mean, can you imagine Iron Man stuck in development hell for like decades?
Decades. Seriously.
Seriously. We're talking Universal had the rights at one point, then Fox. New Line Cinema even took a swing at it.
Wow. I mean, talk about a sliding doors moment for superhero movies, right? Can you imagine how different things would be if one of those studios had cracked the code back then?
Completely different cinematic landscape, probably. But as fate would have it, Marvel Studios swooped in back in 2005 and reclaimed those rights. And here's the real kicker. They decided to make Iron Man their first self-financed film.
Talk about a power move. That took guts. Especially considering, like you said, Iron Man wasn't exactly a guaranteed box office smash.
Massive risk. And, the prevailing trend in superhero movies back then, particularly the big budget ones, was to go dark, gritty. Think Batman Begins, which, don't get me wrong, is a fantastic film.
Absolutely.
But Iron Man went in a completely different direction. They embraced the humor, the quick wit, even a touch of that classic Robert Downey Jr. charm.
And speaking of Robert Downey Jr., let's talk about the man who brought Iron Man to life.
Because let's be real, he is Iron Man.
Right. It's hard to imagine anyone else in that role now, but casting him was, well, it was another one of those risky moves, wasn't
A
it?
huge risk. I mean, this is back when RDJ was considered, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly Hollywood's golden boy at the time.
Yeah, the Time article really dives into his personal struggles and how that almost derailed his entire career. But Favreau, the director, he saw something special in RDJ, something that went beyond those past struggles.
He saw Tony Stark in him. And it wasn't just about the surface level similarities, although they're definitely there. It's like he understood that RDJ could bring a certain depth and vulnerability to the role.
And that's the magic of casting, right? Finding an actor who doesn't just play the part but embodies it. And RDJ, he didn't just embody Tony Stark, he became him.
And it breathed life into the entire film. I mean, it could have been a disaster. Think about it. Casting a risky actor for a risky film.
Talk about a recipe for disaster. But instead, it became this legendary pairing. It's a good reminder that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards.
Absolutely. Now, moving from the man behind the mask to the look of the film itself, the production design was incredible. They managed to create a world that felt both familiar and completely fantastical.
Right. And they made a conscious choice not to just drop Iron Man into a generic city. They really built this distinct visual language for the film.
Exactly. And they were very conscious of trying to ground the technology and make it feel as real as possible, or at least as real as it can make a guy flying around in a weaponized suit.
Right. It's still a superhero movie after all, but they used a lot of practical effects, built actual tangible suits, which I think makes a huge difference.
Huge difference. It makes you feel like you can reach out and touch the suit.
Hey.
Like it really exists in the world. And that plays into the whole idea that Tony Stark is, at his core, an engineer. He's not relying on magic or superpowers. It's all about innovation and ingenuity.
Right. This isn't some mystical artifact. It's a product of his intellect, which makes the whole thing strangely relatable, even if it is about a billionaire playboy superhero.
Exactly. And this leads us nicely to the narrative choices. Because this isn't just your typical good guy versus bad guy story. Iron Man throws in some really interesting twists and turns, which adds a layer of complexity. Like take that opening scene, for example. Starting the film with that ambush in Afghanistan was a bold choice.
Oh, definitely. It throws you right into the action before you even have time to process what's happening. One minute you're riding along in a Humvee, and the next it's explosions and chaos. And then the story rewinds to show you how Tony Stark ended up in that life or death situation.
It's such a gripping way to start the film because it immediately establishes the stakes. You're thrown right into the heart of the conflict, and then it takes you back to the beginning to show you how we got there.
And it's in those quieter moments, those moments before the ambush, where you really start to understand Tony Stark as a character. Like those scenes with reporter Christine Everhart. She's trying to hold him accountable for the actions of his company, and he's just so quick, so charming, that he almost manages to deflect those tough questions. Almost.
Yeah, and the film analysis really digs into that dynamic, suggesting that Iron Man is, in many ways, a response to post-9/11 anxieties, particularly about technology and its role in warfare. Tony Stark's journey, from a man who profits from conflict to a hero trying to atone for his past, it really taps into something very real, very raw. It's about the complexities of power, the burden of responsibility, and the consequences of our creations.
It's deep stuff, especially for a superhero movie. And I think that's what makes his transformation so compelling. He's not just battling villains, he's battling his own demons.
Exactly. And the film challenges a lot of those classic superhero tropes along the way. I mean, for starters, Tony Stark doesn't exactly shy away from the spotlight. He doesn't hide behind a mask. He actually reveals his identity to the world.
Which was a huge deal, especially back then. Most superheroes went to great lengths to protect their secret identities.
Right. But Tony Stark, he owns it. And the ending, it's not your typical good versus evil showdown either. It's more about Tony Stark coming to terms with who he is, the impact of his actions, and the weight of responsibility that comes with his power. It stays with you long after the credits roll. It really makes you think about the ramifications of technology and the choices we make. And speaking of things that stay with you, we can't end this part of the discussion without talking about that post-credit scene.
Oh man, the chills. The moment Nick Fury steps into the frame and utters those words, Avengers Initiative, it's like the entire cinematic landscape shifted.
Talk about a game changer. That single scene, tucked away after the credits, was a glimpse into a much larger world, a hint of things to come. And little did we know just how much bigger things were going to get.
Right. It was a stroke of genius because you could have easily missed it if you weren't paying attention. It's like a little Easter egg for the fans. But it ended up being so much more than that. It was the spark that ignited the entire MCU.
And who could have predicted back then just how massive that spark would become? It's amazing to think that one little scene, almost an afterthought, had such a massive impact on the future of superhero movies.
Right. It's like who knew that sticking around after the credits would unlock this whole other level of the cinematic universe?
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most unexpected details can have the biggest impact.
Absolutely. But okay, before we get too far into the weeds of the MCU, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier. You mentioned that casting RDJ was a risk, and not just because of, his personal life at that time, but also because Iron Man himself wasn't exactly a sure thing. What was it about the character, do you think, that made studios hesitant to take that leap?
Well, I think you have to remember that back in the early 2000s, the idea of a flawed hero, even kind of an unlikable hero, it was still a pretty risky proposition in Hollywood.
Right. Superheroes back then were supposed to be these squeaky clean symbols of morality, not, billionaire playboys with a bit of a dark side.
Exactly. And Tony Stark, he was kind of all dark side in the beginning. He's got this massive ego, a sarcastic streak a mile wide, and his moral compass, well, let's just say it needed a little recalibration.
Yeah, he's no Captain America, that's for sure.
Not even close. But I think that's part of what makes him so interesting. He's not this perfect, untouchable icon. He's messy, he's flawed, but he's also incredibly human. He screws up, he struggles with his inner demons, and he has to really work to redeem himself. And that journey, that's something that resonates with audiences.
It's like we see parts of ourselves, our own imperfections, reflected in him.
Exactly. And that's the genius of Iron Man. It takes this kind of obscure comic book character and makes him relatable, flawed, and ultimately deeply human.
And RDJ, he just nails that complexity.
Perfectly. Yeah. Okay, I want to shift gears a bit now and dive into the nuts and bolts of the film itself. The outline we're working with mentions a cold open now. For those of us who aren't film buffs, can you explain what that means and why it was such an effective choice for Iron Man?
You got it. Cold open. Basically, it's that scene that happens right before the opening credits roll, usually meant to grab your attention and set the tone. And in Iron Man, we're thrown headfirst into that intense ambush in Afghanistan before we even really know who Tony Stark is.
Right from the start, you're thrown off balance. It's not your typical lighthearted superhero intro.
It's jarring. 1 minute you're cruising along, and then bam, explosions, chaos. You're right in the middle of a war zone. It's intense, and it really sets the stage for the rest of the film.
Definitely. You're not easing into this world. You're thrown right into the fire. And it really sets the tone for the kind of ride you're in for.
Speaking of fire, the film doesn't shy away from the fact that Tony Stark made his fortune selling weapons, does it? There are some really uncomfortable truths being exposed there.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It actually confronts those issues head on. Remember those scenes with Christine Everhart, that reporter who keeps pushing him about the consequences of his company's actions?
Oh, yeah, she does not let him off the hook. She's like his conscience, constantly reminding him of the human cost of his pursuit of profit.
And Tony, for all his charm and wit, you can see that her words are getting to him. They're making him question things, making him confront the ethical implications of his life's work.
And that internal conflict, that struggle to reconcile his past with who he wants to be, that's what really drives his transformation.
It's a journey that so many people can relate to, the idea that we could be complicit in harmful systems, even if we don't see ourselves as bad people. And I think that's something that elevates Iron Man beyond a typical action movie. It's grappling with these big ethical questions.
And it doesn't offer easy answers. It's complex, and it challenges the audience to think critically about these issues.
Absolutely. And it's all the more powerful because it's playing out against the backdrop of these post-9/11 anxieties, this unease about the power of technology and its potential for both good and evil.
It's like the film is holding up a mirror to our own relationship with technology, isn't it? On the one hand, you have Tony Stark's brilliance, his ability to create these incredible inventions, but then there's that constant fear, what if that technology falls into the wrong hands? What happens when we lose control of the things we create?
Exactly. And the film doesn't shy away from the fact that those questions don't have simple answers. Technology itself isn't inherently good or evil. It's all about how we choose to use it. And that's the challenge that Tony Stark ultimately has to face.
Right. He has to take responsibility for the harm his inventions have caused and use his genius to make things right. It's not enough to just build the suit he has, to be willing to step inside it and fight for what he believes in.
And that's where the true heroism lies, I think. It's not just about the gadgets or the cool suit. It's about that internal struggle, that moral reckoning. It's about recognizing that even geniuses screw up. And sometimes the greatest act of heroism is admitting your mistakes and trying to do better.
It's a powerful message, and it's one that I think resonates even more strongly today in a world where technology is advancing faster than ever before.
It makes you wonder, what would a modern-day Iron Man story look like? What kind of ethical dilemmas would he be facing? It's an interesting thought experiment.
It really is. Okay, I want to touch on another character for a moment because the outline we have here mentions that Pepper Potts is far more than just a love interest in this film. Can you elaborate on that a bit? How does her character contribute to the overall depth of the story?
Pepper Potts is essential to Tony Stark's journey. She's his rock, his confidant, and she's not afraid to call him out on his crap.
She really isn't, and she's not just there to look pretty and wait for him to save the day. She's smart, she's resourceful, and she plays a very active role in helping him become a better man.
Exactly. Remember that scene where she helps him remove the arc reactor from his chest? It's such a powerful moment of vulnerability and trust between them, and it really underscores how important she is to him.
She sees the good in him, even when he doesn't see it in himself. And she's not afraid to challenge him, to push him to be better. They have this really interesting dynamic that goes way beyond the typical superhero love story.
Completely agree. Their relationship adds a whole other layer of complexity and depth to the film. Okay, I know we can't put it off any longer. We have to talk about that post-credit scene.
Yeah.
The one that changed everything.
The Nick Fury cameo.
Right.
Seriously, chills every time I think about it. It's such a small moment, but it had such huge implications for the future of the MCU.
Right. I mean, it was our first glimpse into this larger world of superheroes, this interconnected universe that was just waiting to be explored. It was like a secret handshake between the filmmakers and the audience, a promise of bigger and better things to come.
And it completely rewrote the rules for superhero movies. Suddenly, it wasn't just about one hero's journey. It was about building a whole universe where these characters could interact and their stories could intertwine.
And it all started with that one little scene. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It's crazy to think how one small scene had such a massive ripple effect, completely changing the game for superhero movies. Talk about a legacy. But we've been talking about how Iron Man was such a hit back in 2008. It got me thinking, would it have the same impact if it came out today?
That's a really interesting question. The world has changed a lot in the last 15 years, and so has our relationship with technology.
Right. Like back then, the idea of a billionaire tech genius building a high-tech suit in a cave felt, I don't know, kind of inspiring, but now I'm not so sure.
Yeah, the whole billionaire savior trope, it doesn't really hold the same weight anymore, does it? We're more aware of the complexities, the power imbalances, the ethical questions surrounding wealth and technology.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, if Iron Man came out today, would people be so quick to root for the flawed billionaire with all the answers?
Right. Audiences today are savvier, more tuned to issues of social justice, corporate responsibility, all of that.
So where does that leave Iron Man's legacy? Is it still relevant in a world that's arguably a lot more cynical than it was back in 2008?
Well, I think Iron Man's legacy is more about the themes it explores than the specifics of its time. It's about the idea that redemption is possible, even for someone who's made a lot of mistakes.
And that it's a process, not a destination. Tony Stark doesn't just throw on a suit and suddenly become a saint. He stumbles, he messes up, he has to constantly work at being a better person.
Exactly. And that struggle, that constant push and pull between our flaws and our desire to be better, that's something that's always going to be relevant. Plus, you can't deny the impact Iron Man had on the superhero genre. It proves that these movies could be more than just popcorn entertainment. They could be smart, funny, visually stunning, and still have something important to say.
Totally. Iron Man raised the bar for what a superhero movie could be. It showed that you could have heart, humor, and some seriously thought-provoking themes all wrapped up in one action-packed package.
Exactly. And that influence can still be felt today. The superhero movies we see now, they owe a lot to what Iron Man accomplished.
It's like it laid the groundwork for this whole new era of superhero cinema. So even if the specifics of Tony Stark's story feel a little dated now, the core themes, the exploration of complex characters, the moral dilemmas, those are all things that continue to resonate.
And they'll continue to resonate with audiences for years to come. Because ultimately, we're all drawn to stories about flawed individuals trying to find their place in the world, trying to make things right. And that's a story that's never going to get old.
Well said. It looks like we've reached the end of our Iron Man deep dive. It's been a wild ride, from the origins of the character to the impact of that groundbreaking 2008 film and beyond.
It's amazing to see how much this one character has shaped the landscape of superhero movies and how those ripples continue to spread even today.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What kind of heroes do we need in today's world? What challenges do they face? And how can we all strive to be a little bit more heroic in our own lives?
Big questions to ponder.
They are, but that's what this deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and keep exploring.